Thank you.
Okay, and now for the next session, may I have the privilege of first inviting Yogesh. He heads the Stackroot Enterprise Business for IT, and he will further, have a discussion with our star speaker for today, which is Devdutt Pattanaik. He needs no introduction, Mr. Devdutt Pattanaik, a leading Indian mythologist, a speaker, illustrator, and an author. He will talk about learning principles from mythology and how they relate to our corporate life. So over here right now we have Yogesh first, and Yogesh, I would request you to take it forward with Devdutt. Hi Devdutt. Hi
Hi.
Yogesh. Over to you, Yogesh.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prateek. Um, it is indeed a great opportunity for me to speak to somebody who I really admire for his sheer brilliance in both the writings as well as the sessions which he has in TED and otherwise. This is my uh, privilege to welcome Mr. Devdutt Pattanaik here. Welcome, Mr. Devdutt. Let me, obviously, while he does not need any introduction, but let me just say a few things. Mr. Devdutt Pattanaik is author of 50 books, about 1,000 columns, and lots of them are bestsellers. He writes on the relevance of mythology in modern times, and that's what makes his writing so interesting and engaging both together, and as well as useful, because you can apply. And this whole session is about applied mythology. That's the overall theme under which we are doing this. Interestingly, and I got to know of this fairly recently, that he was trained in medicine. So he's actually a medical doctor, and he worked for 15 years in healthcare and pharma industry. And after that, he plunged full time into his passion. So not only he's a great author, great speaker, he's also a great role model for anyone who wants to follow his or her own passion. That you can do that at your time of choosing. He's very well known for his TED Talks and TV shows, especially Devdutt, and his innovative views on culture, leadership, and Indian approach to management is what he's really famous for. Let me again take this opportunity to welcome Mr. Devdutt here. Welcome. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much. So this is a learning session, and the fun thing about learning is to realize that is the one thing that distinguishes humans from animals. So
Mr. Devdutt, if I may, so yeah, we are all very keen to hear you. Just wanted to set a little context for you and our audience here. See, as we all know, right now the world has just seen a pandemic of an order which has never been seen, at least in recent history, or maybe for a very, very long time. Unprecedented crisis, right? Now, today, we have come to terms with COVID-19. We have learned how to handle it better. We know how to work while the pandemic is still on. We know how to really progress. We know how to deal with the overall, while doing all of this, we know how to deal with that. We are much better than what, say, for example, we were, say, in April, when there was a lockdown and, everybody was just almost in a jail type of a situation, right? If you look at the audience here, there are many leaders here who are themselves technologists, and definitely there are leaders who have used digital technology to lead the business revival. Business is seeing a revival even while the COVID is going on. And of course, there are leaders here who have done that. So really great job done by industry in these trying times. But at the same time, the crisis is far from over. Vaccines are just now coming in. In fact, yesterday there was an announcement, and we are all very keenly waiting for the time when vaccines can really go to a scale where pandemic really gets under control, right? Very fact that we are all here in this virtual session, as against our usual venue, which is Goa for all the earlier Confluence, says that business is not usual. It's not yet business as usual. Now, that's a background. And the session here is learning principles from ancient civilization. So that's the context and that's a background, right? With that, what I would want you to delve on, essentially to begin with, on three questions. Number one, does a crisis become a hindrance to learning, or is it an opportunity to learn? So would be very keen, I'm sure everyone will be very keen to hear your views on that. Number two, does learning during a crisis play a significant role in coming out of it? Does learning help in coming out of crisis, or learning can be set aside till the time you deal with crisis, and after that, learning can come in? So these are really the questions which I had. And with that, let me invite you to hear your views. I'm sure everybody is just waiting to hear from you. Over to you, Mr. Devdutt.
Thank you, Yogesh. So you see, learning is an interesting thing because first question is, does crisis enable learning? And the second question is, does learning disable crisis? So that's broadly what everybody is asking these questions. And as NIIT, it's understandable. These are, learning is a subject that everybody values. Saraswati is a very important goddess in mythology, but we don't see Saraswati temples. You will find images of Saraswati in schools and libraries. The moment you go to a bank, you will see a Lakshmi image over there. Saraswati sometimes linked to Ganpati, sometimes is linked with Lakshmi. But this whole idea of a big temple where there is Saraswati being celebrated is not a major thing. And the reason is because learning is a complex process. It demands a lot of people. It basically demands restructuring of the brain, rewiring of the brain, and we naturally resist it. Interestingly, someone told me the other day that the body, whenever it achieves anything new, even exercise, it resists. So your body doesn't want to go to the gym because it resists it. It wants to be in a state of inertia. And it doesn't want to, what the force required to shift the situation is there in going to the gym, in going to the school. So the way children cry when they have to go to school, you'll see adults crying when they have to go to a gym. And that's the same thing. But even adult learning remains difficult because it is, we associate learning with childhood. So even when we say brahmacharya ashram, grahastha ashram, this whole thing of childhood is when you learn, and once you are grown up, you don't need to learn, and it's almost a burden off your shoulders. But then you are told in companies that no, you have to upskill yourself, you have to learn new things, and that's a traumatic idea. Because the whole thing that what I've learned is not enough to progress. What we have to understand is that human culture, by definition, is about upskilling. And the difference between the humans and the ape is that if you look at 10 generations of ape, across 10 generations, there is no new learning which happens in the apes. So after 10 generations, the ape behaves exactly like its ancestor 10 generations ago. 10 generations of apes and nothing has changed really. So, but humans over 10 generations have gone through dramatic transformation. So 10 generations ago, one generation being 25 years roughly, so about 250 years ago, we did not have the industrial revolution, right? We did not have industries, we did not have electricity, we did not have trains. And think of us, our generation, who are in their 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s. We have immigrated to the world of digital economy. But the young generation is born in digital technology. We have immigrated. We have come from a world of analog and we have entered the digital technology and seen the rise of the internet in our lifetime. When we were in school and colleges, we didn't learn it. The new child who is born is going to directly plunge into the digital economy. And what is interesting is the children today don't know how those old phones were used. Remember those analog phones? One of the best experiments, you can just show your child a phone and it doesn't know how it operates. Can't believe it is without buttons. Cannot believe the absence of a screen, that you couldn't see people you were talking to. The idea of international dialing, the idea of trunk calls. These are all now ancient memory for most people. So humans learn with time. Whether it is progress or not is open to conversations and theoretical debates. But the fact is, society keeps shifting as new learning technologies emerge. And we forget old technologies. So although we all came from hunter-gatherers and nomads, and then we became agriculturists, and then we became herdsmen, and then gradually became industrialists, we can't go back. We'll never go back to the old ways. You cannot recreate, although we think of organic and I'll go back to the farm and live. This is never going to happen. It is an entry which is so convenient that you forget the past. And that is a human history. So if you look at human history moving, it is constantly moving in a particular direction. We learn new technologies, which we upskill ourselves, we learn new things, it becomes so convenient and comfortable that we don't really go back. So in this COVID situation, new things have happened. And we will never really go back to a pre-COVID world. We will go to a new world, which will be informed by the pre-COVID thinking and by the COVID world. So that is the shift which has happened. And we will have a new world order of people traumatized by COVID. And we'll have to deal with it. And since we're dealing with a lot of bankers today, the biggest realization is the value of resources. Money. How do I get access to money? Physical money, digital money, earning money, saving money, deciding how much to spend. Do I become conservative? So all that comes into the picture. I know for a personal fact that I wanted to change something in my systematic withdrawal plan. And I realized that the banks were not equipped to handle the load because they were used for paperwork. And I was shocked that it was still done by paper in many banks. And what should have taken less than 24 hours to 3 months to solve. So, and if I look at the advertising, it all said it's at the press of a button. But nobody realized the scale. And India especially provides a huge challenge because at one level, we have international quality customers. At the other level, we have people who have no access to the digital economy. And they are not a small number. There are millions and millions of Indians who don't have access to the digital economy. India is one of those countries. We are not like China, which can just destroy systems. Although many people are aspiring to turn India into China, I don't think it is possible, but we can dream. And I don't think India wants to become China, where everything is homogenized. We have always had an organic model. And one thing we must remember about India is that the bullock cart is still used in India, even though there are people with private jets. And as a banker, you have to decide which market are you dealing with, and the higher you go, you have to handle both ends of the spectrum. Unfortunately, the Western model is they forget the old model, while India demands you remember the old model. You can't let go. So this whole vision that many politicians have of a digital economy where you'll never use paper may work in other parts of the world, but in India, you have to keep in mind that there are millions of people with very low assets who would want the old banking systems. And then you have to ask the humanitarian question, do they matter? Because there is more business with the rich and there is allegedly less business with the poor, but the number of the poor is much more. And this diversity is what makes India. So when we think about India and you're thinking of pre-COVID times and post-COVID times, all conversations have to take into consideration one, the scale. Indian scale. We can never reach every Indian. Aadhaar, everybody assumes Aadhaar reaches every Indian. It does not. We know that for a fact. Of course, nobody wants to talk about it, but we know that it is a real challenge. You can get the best minds of America, you can get Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos sitting in one room and they will still not be able to handle, because India is a huge country. One. Second, not only is it huge, it is diverse. It is economically diverse, it is politically diverse, it is geographically diverse. Because there are people living on the mountains, there are people living in the desert, there are people living in the coasts, there are people living in dense jungles, and they all want access to the internet. They all want access, they all can download your software. And when I try, and the third thing to remember in India, one is scale, the second is diversity, the third is dynamic. It is not static, it is continuously changing, regularly changing in different ways. The rate is different, the quality is different, which makes India an extremely complex problem. And no one bank can ever solve all of it. Although we aspire for it, the tragedy is because we look at the delusion of the Excel sheet and we live in the bubble of the internet, we don't realize that there are grades of internet in India. Grades of internet, and you have to be prepared to handle. So biggest learning for most leaders is handle the scale, handle the diversity, and handle the dynamism. Three major challenges. I have seen the smartest people in our country don't get it. I always tell people, when I go to ATM, I have seen, and I'm not far away, my own staff. I have diversity in my staff. Somebody is literate, somebody is not literate. Somebody is literate but in Hindi. But his Hindi is not so good as to understand the complicated technical words that are found on the screen of. So who will teach the IT to empathize with this complex human problem? And these are the challenges. They won't go away. They will only multiply as new technology emerges. Technology tries to homogenize. It creates a delusion of homogeneity. But there is nothing like homogeneity in the world, but in India especially. So China, for example, homogenizes China by saying everybody will use the Mandarin script. The Hong Kong Chinese speak Cantonese. So now China is going to wipe out that culture in order to create efficiency and effectiveness. India doesn't do that, at least not yet. So the Chinese model is about bulldozing through, destroying diversity, how much ever they may deny it. They have rejected the old classical language. The entire script that they use is very different from the old language. So all these things have to be understood, this complexity. And this complexity is the space in which India exists. So how do I understand India? It is not using rationality. You can use all the rational, you can use the statistical data, all that. But to get to the mind of Indians, the simple technique is to use mythology as a toolkit. So for me, mythology is a toolkit. And when we talk about applied mythology, it is a toolkit. It allows you to access the mind of the Indian people in an easy way. It's not the complete truth. There is always need for data, other forms of data, other forms of knowledge. But a simple technique to use is to understand a mythology. So, for example, let me show you the difference. When I talk of Western mythology, I'm usually talking about Greek mythology and the biblical traditions, the biblical mythology and Greek mythology. And what is common between these two? The common idea between Greek mythology and biblical mythology is both believe there is only one life. And when you live only once, you are aspiring to live it perfectly. Ek hi chance hai. You have no second chance. There is no third chance. One chance, you have to live perfectly. At the end of it, you will be judged. In the biblical traditions, you are judged on the basis of alignment. Have you aligned to God's law? In the Greek traditions, you are judged on the basis of have you done something extraordinary. Now look at our management practices. Every quarter you are judged. At the end of the year, you are judged. Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, annual appraisal, judgment. You're constantly being judged. Now, if you are junior, you are judged on whether you have done your task. So task alignment, very biblical. Have you done what the God has told you to do? If you have done it, you will be rewarded with heaven. We call it bonus or promotion. But then if you're senior, they will ask you, like the Greeks, have you been heroic? Have you done something different? Words used for this are innovation, out of the box thinking. Have you changed the way we are looking at business? Strategic model. So we celebrate Jeff Bezos, we celebrate Bill Gates. These are people who change the way we think. Look at the power of Twitter today. So changing the way you think. So it's very heroic. It's very Greek, individual. Never the organization, the individual. But when you see the biblical model, it's always the organization. Judgment of the organization, judgment of the individual. This is the classic Western model. Now, why do I say it is not the Indian model? Because in India, the concept of God as judge does not exist. You don't find it in Buddhism. You don't find it in Jainism. You don't find it in Hinduism. The stories that people told each other for thousands of years did not include a judge or judgment day. Qayamat, as it is called. These ideas were imported to India over centuries, first through mercantile networks, that was the old networks, and then through military networks. But these imagine, it's called the Persian cosmopolis. The Persian cosmopolis enters India roughly around 1300 AD. Between 300 and 1300 AD, there was a Sanskrit cosmopolis. In this cosmopolis, you had no concept of judge. So when you read a Manusmriti and all, there is no judge. But there is karma. Karma is accounting. So God is not a judge. God is an accountant. Now, what is the fundamental difference between the legal framework and the accounting framework is what we have to understand. The accounting framework, there is no full stop. There is only comma. You're constantly creating new versions. You're constantly improving. You're changing. You're going through. There is no full stop. It never ends. There is no retirement. You go, or even there's no death. There is no retirement. There's no death. Karma just keeps following you. It's like an account book. Hisab kitab. How much debt? How much equity? How much debt? How much equity? It never ends. So it's learning cycles. You keep learning and learning and learning and learning and learning and forgetting and forgetting and forgetting. So learning and forgetting is part of your being. It never ends. So when you read the Jain scriptures, they will say, there is no beginning of the world, there is no end of the world, there is no creator. Anadi Ananta. It just keeps flowing. Different things happen. And the flow is up and down, boom and bust, boom and bust, boom and bust. Good times, bad times, good times, bad times. And what we are experiencing with COVID is bad times. But as the scriptures say, they will come, they will go. They will come, they will go. It never ends. So look at Ramayana. Ramayana will talk about bad times. Ram is about to be crowned a king and he's told to go to the forest for 14 years. Luckily, he knows when it will come to an end. We don't. Mahabharata. So in Ram's case, he did not choose the tragedy. The tragedy was imposed upon him by palace politics. In the Mahabharata, it's very different. The Pandavas gamble their own kingdom. So they are stupid. They did something wrong, and as a result, they are thrown into the jungle again. So Vanaprastha, Vanaprastha or Vanavasa is there in Ramayana and Mahabharata for two totally different reasons. One is forced to go, the other makes mistakes and enters the forest. So you enter a crisis space either of your own creation, you have done something wrong, or circumstances have put you. COVID is circumstances. And you are there. So, and same idea, when you read the Bible, for example, they will always talk of crisis, but here crisis is always God's will. So you have the flood which comes and everybody is suffering. But the idea of crisis is universal. So every culture talks about crisis. In the Indian model, the crisis is the result of something else. In the Western model, it is always God's will. Those who don't believe in God will say it is the result of human activity. So if you read Marxist texts, all tragedy comes because humans have not respected other human beings. There is no God, there is no supernatural element. right? There's a blame, there's a constant blame. Either you blame the oppressor or you accept it is God's will. In the Indian tradition, it is different. There is, कभी तुम्हारे वजह से होता है, you become hubris, जुआ खेल के अपना इंद्रप्रस्थ हारते हो, और कभी kaikais and political machinations come, or you have done something in your past life, or somebody has given you shrap, and you have no control over these things, and you become going to Vanavas. And Vanavas is the place where you learn. So whenever they talk of the forest in Hindu mythology, and I will specifically talk on Hindu mythology, although the principles are across Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism, one of the dominant thoughts in Indian philosophy and mythology is the difference between the forest and the field. Field is the familiar territory over which you have control. So Gram, which is familiar, you have controls, you have sets, principles, sub control mein hai. Forest is a place where you have no control. There are many things happening in the forest. You have no control at all. So in the forest, you are just an animal. So when the Pandavas go to the forest, they discover for the horror that they are no longer prince. The wild boar treats them like a normal human being. The monkeys treat them like normal human beings. They see them as another species of animal. So in the COVID, which is nature's Vanavas for us at a metaphorical level, the biggest CEOs had to wash bartan. Why? औकात लेके आया है. जंगल में औकात पता चलता है कि लास्ट में खुद खाना पकाना पड़ता है, खुद कपड़े धोने पड़ते हैं. You have to figure out how to manage the house. And those who are, say that I have a big house, we can all be in 3 rooms. It means you have to clean 3 rooms, sweep 3 rooms, swab 3 rooms. But those who live in one house will say, well, I have very less to clean, but you have to sit together and everybody has a screen in front of them. There is no eye contact within the family. It has its own problems. So when you are thinking of banking softwares and technology, are you catering to the one with 3 rooms, 300 bedrooms, or 1 room? Because they all are going to bank. Different numbers, different softwares, different apps, but they all are going to bank and they all matter to you. And then you realize that at a metaphorical level, the scriptures are telling us about crisis. And in crisis, there is learning happening all the time. So you have the Pandavas being educated by Shiva, who takes the form of Kirat Arjun. The details of the story, you'll have to read the Mahabharata, but for the sake of lectures, in the forest, you have Hanuman coming and dealing with Bhima, or you have Yaksha or Yamaraja dealing with Yudhishthira. All the birds and animals are essentially educating the Pandavas that you are not special. Please remember. And therefore, it's a privilege when you go back to the forest, know your privilege. Know how entitled you were when you entered the forest. And when they serve as servants, for 1 year, Agyatavas, the Pandavas have to be servants. They realize what it means to be a king, the privilege of being a king, and how do you deal with people who are lesser than you, who don't have the resources you have, who don't have the access you have. So biggest learning for the Pandavas is that, Ghamand ko niche karo. And Ghamand is a very, mythological word. For us, day-to-day life is we just don't pay attention to the complexities of our employees and our customers. And no matter how much you know, there is always more to learn. There is always more to learn. Your employees, what do they go through? You'll suddenly realize how many of your employees are migrants. How many of them feel comfortable working from their native homes if they have a good internet connection. How many of them were PGs? How many of them were sharing accommodation? How many of them could afford internet? You suddenly realize the same thing about customers. How many of your customers can manage without coming to the branch office? And how many cannot? In cities, maybe I can afford to live without a bank. But in smaller towns where I'm uneducated, where I speak a folk language which does not even have a script, but need access to the Aadhaar and to the banking platform to get that money that the government may give me. These complex processes are what make us human and make us great. It's not about just making profit. That can be, for some people, the most important thing in the world. But for a large number of people, It is to make our lives meaningful and valuable, which may or may not include profit. And that is what this crisis teaches us. In the Ramayana, it gets even more exciting. In the Ramayana, when you enter the forest, you deal with Sanskrit scholars. Now, let me explain this. So, there are two people that Ram encounters in the forest. One is Ravan and the other is Hanuman. Both are Sanskrit scholars. Both are educated in the Vedas, but look at the difference. One is riding a Pushpaka Vimana. One is sitting in an island kingdom of gold. One is a king who has so much power, a Vedic scholar, Sanskrit expert, educated, Shiva Bhakta. What does he spend all his time doing? Torturing people, abducting the wife of a man for his perceived notions of justice. It's about him. The narrative is about him. And then you see Hanuman, who is also educated, extremely powerful, but doesn't know he's powerful. Lives in the forest, serving Sugriv, who is much lesser than him in terms of capability. He is the most powerful being in the forest who behaves like a commoner, messenger, taking care of people, serving people, does not want to be the sovereign, does not wish to be the king, is very happy with his life, encounters Ram, enables him, uplifts him, solves problems. If Ravan is the problem, Hanuman becomes the solution. And you realize both of them are being encountered in the forest. And Ram sees the spectrum of human capability. At one side, you have Ravan, who has everything but is insecure. And Hanuman, who has nothing but is supremely secure. Curious monkey. The word monkey was used by the poets, perhaps to talk about curiosity. The human ability to be curious, to understand, to learn. You know, there is a story in the folk Ramayana that Anjani, the mother of Hanuman, one day tells him, "What have you been doing all these years?" And Hanuman narrates the Ramayana to tell her the story of how, along with the Vanars, he built a bridge to Lanka to rescue Sita for Ram. But the funny thing is, at the end of the story, the mother is not impressed at all by by Hanuman's story. She says, "You know what? The story is not impressive at all because I know how much strength you have, my son. With a flick of your tail, you could have defeated Ravan. Why did you go through this charade of building a bridge and fighting Ravan in a war when you could have destroyed him in a second with your strength?" And Hanuman tells his mother Anjani, "For only one reason, mother. Ram never asked me to do it. Ram never told me to flick my tail and defeat Ravan. I just followed his instructions and I did whatever he told me to do." And you suddenly realize when you hear the story that even Ram did not know the possibility of Hanuman. In our organization, we have so many talented people capable of so much. When we engage with them only through WhatsApp and emails and Zoom calls, do we see their full capability? How do we identify and harness capability that is there out there? How many Hanumans are there in our team? These are things that will continue to happen after the COVID. Because when you meet people, now you have a knowledge of the pre-COVID world, the COVID possibilities, and the post-COVID opportunities. Because you have seen how the world changes dramatically, how things can happen. And you now look at your people, how they handle the crisis, how they will survive beyond the crisis. And it is your job to figure out how many Hanumans are there, how do we refine their skills, how do I identify and upskill them, what upskilling is required for my employees, for my partners, for my vendors, for my customers. Were the screens I designed of good quality? How do I improve? I think that's what learning is all about. This Vanavasa is an opportunity for us to reflect on what we know and what we can know and how much more we can learn. So I think that's the big lesson from mythology, to reflect on our learning capabilities and how we have not realized the full potential and the possibilities and opportunities out there. And that's my talk for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much. Very, very enlightening. And I think I got all the answers to what I had initially. Um, I just one announcement for everyone. Please do start sharing your questions on the question or the ask forum, and I will ask them on your behalf. Given time, I'll have some limited questions. But before I go to audience question, I have some questions of my own. One thing, of course, you said many things and very interesting, but let me just start with one very, very key idea. Mythology is a toolkit, very powerful. I mean, that's a great way to look at mythology. Um, I just wanted to reflect back on theme of this conference as well. Confluence 2021, as we call it. The theme is accelerating performance through transformative learning. And there is something very interesting when I was reading something which you wrote way back in 2012. I will first just read out the definition of what do we mean by transformative learning. And we are focused on that today. That's why that's the theme. Transformative learning is the idea that learners who are getting new information are also evaluating their past ideas and understanding and are shifting their very worldview as they obtain new information and through critical reflection. So, and of course, it goes on to say that it goes beyond simply acquiring knowledge and dives into the way the learners find meaning in their lives and understanding. That's what we mean by transformative learning. That's a definition of this century, of course, by an American scientist. Now, I was reading a text which you wrote in 2012. It says, when teachers learn and students teach. And I'm just quoting from you, so I will read it out so that I don't make a mistake. It says, the fundamental difference between modern education system and sermons and the Guru Shishya Parampara is the notion of objectivity. Is knowledge objective or subjective? Information is objective, but knowledge is subjective. And the next piece is what is really very interesting to me. To know, you have to understand. To understand, you have to interpret what the other says, analyze it, and place it within the context of what you already know and understand. And then you go on to say that learning is an extremely complex process, and ancient Indians were aware of that. Now that's it matches the definition so well that I'm getting goose pimples now, right? Now what somebody is discovering today is rooted in this thought. Actually, to me, of course, there will be more differences as we go into detail, but at the high level, the idea is very, very similar. Now, using mythology as a toolkit, so there is something in Guru Shishya Parampara which might be useful. Now, we cannot change the education system entirely. We cannot change the corporate training system entirely, and we must not, right? There's something good in that. And however, there must be something in Guru Shishya Parampara which we can apply, right? What are those principles in your view from Guru Shishya Parampara, especially in the organizational training and development perspective, which can be applied in your view? I would be very keen to hear that.
So the way we see knowledge is like a download. So it's like a software download or a patch download. And the general thing is the child goes into the school or a student comes into the school. There is a software download that is happening, that is downloaded, and people take it. Some people take part of it, some take it full of it, and that has a shift in the code that you had before it. That's the traditional model. And then you keep going through it. They keep using words like habit. You keep doing it again and again, and a habit will form. Now, habits are with animals. Dogs have habits, and you changing. So it's looking at humans as animals and saying that you have reward and you have reward and discipline and then habits. These words clearly show how humans are being seen in some of the educational models. The other model is to, when you have an idea and you're trying to explain to 3 students, and as you're explaining to the 3 students, each student some students can't understand it. Some people can understand it but find flaws in the system. And third, take the system and come up with newer ideas. So you can have 3 different types of students responding to what you're going to tell them. Now, when you receive this, the first student is telling you that he's not receiving it. He realizes that your communication skills perhaps need to be further refined so that he can understand it. The second student who comes up with objections forces you to look at your knowledge and say, you know what, there are kinks in the armor, there is weak spots that I can strengthen. And the third student makes you suddenly aware that there is more opportunities out there in terms of knowledge. So now who has learned in this interaction? Have the 3 students learned or the teachers learned? So there is a cyclical nature of learning that happens when you sit with people and you work with people. And this is what the Guru Shishya Param. So the students are as much for the teacher as they are for the student. While he's transmitting his knowledge, he's also enhancing his knowledge. So everybody is going through a transformation. The teacher at the beginning of the session, at the end of the session is not the same person. Definitely the students came in because they want to go through a transformation. But the stated objective is there only with students. But so if I look at the way the Ramayana is happening is Ram is going into the forest and he's experiencing something. So when he comes back into the kingdom of Ayodhya, he's a transformed human being. But everyone he has encountered has also been transformed by him. And that exchange of information and transformation is something that we don't realize. So this is what makes us human, this ability to keep iterating and improving. That's why we have version 1 download, 2 downloads. It never ends. Really, technology is going in that direction because it is, we realize there are so many human possibilities that you cannot possibly cover everything. Otherwise, there would be no room for refinement.
Great. Thank you very much. And I can really relate to that. This whole idea of knowledge as download, it works for information. It does not work for knowledge. And, we have over time, as we have experienced learning, we have realized that, at some point in time, it was seen that this MOOC, massively online, courses which came, is a solution to all problems. That's how they were presented. But the reality is that the needle moves just by about 8%, 9% of the people who even take it. And out of them, how many really learn that and perform? That's an entirely different question and not probably even studied very well. So that is why we are focused on transformative learning, and great to see how this whole idea of teacher learning from a student is useful. There are lots of teachers here in this room who are teaching in various ways, and I'm sure they have a takeaway here. So thank you for sharing this perspective. I just wanted to ask you another question just in the same theme. In today's world, this whole idea of Guru Shishya Parampara seems to be somewhere going into what I'll call as Google Shishya Parampara. So Google becomes guru for lots of people. And, there is information in that, people will consume that. But for a teacher, it is challenging because, sometimes, as we say, half information is worse than, no information. Half knowledge is definitely worse than no knowledge. So those are the challenges. So in this situation, who is a good teacher? What is there in ancient mythology or history to say who will constitute a good teacher? Should they be very good at skills? Should they be role models? Should they be something else? That I'm sure those who are in the teaching side here will be very interested to hear.
So I think information can easily be outsourced to technology. So a lot of information can be outsourced. Reading can be outsourced. You can hear a video on a Like for example, let's talk about Ramayana, what my subject. So if I want to give a lecture on Ramayana, I'm not going to sit in the class and say, once upon a time there was a king called Dashrath with 3 wives. You better read that up. But now let's have a conversation of why 3 wives? What is the storyteller trying to achieve? Is there a historical precedent to it? Is there a geographical precedent to it? What is the connection between Dashrath, the name, and his relationship to his father? Now, these are thinking questions which Google can have lots and lots of essays, but if you don't have the time and the energy to go through that all, but it is forcing me to think about things, the whys, the hows, because the information is now there. It's there. It's already there. So when I go to lectures, sometimes a long time ago, I was giving a series of lectures in NID, National Institute of Design. I insisted that everybody carry their mobile phone into the classroom. And I was explaining something on design. And I said, okay, let's discuss the Stupa. And they said, sir, we have not taught the Stupa. I said, what do you mean you have not been taught? You have a phone in your hand, you have Wi-Fi in your hand, Google Stupa, and let's spend the next 10 minutes reading about the Stupa. And there were 20 students in the class. I gave each and every one of them a different aspect of the Stupa to read. And I said, now you talk to each other. So I made everyone explain in 1 minute what is the Stupa. At the end of it, there was a collective understanding of teamwork. They all learned little things, they exchanged things. But more importantly, I asked them far more complex questions that could not possibly be asked or Google could not have discussed unless some academic paper out there, which is somewhere hidden, but somebody has to ask the question. So the role, I asked the question about how is the Stupa architecture related to the temple architecture of the 15th century. Now, this is not an easy question. So questioning is what a guru does. The Western model of pedagogy is the teacher answers the student questions. The Indian model is the teacher questions and the students have to answer. And the teacher is not answerable to students because if the student doesn't want to learn, he won't learn. So Vikram and Vetal is a classic model of learning where the Vetal is the teacher. Vetal is the teacher because, and that's a metaphor, because the Vetal is not a king. The king has to go back to his kingdom and manage the problems. The Vetal is only enabling the king to refine his critical thinking so that he can be a better administrator, governor, judge, or whatever he does as a king. So Vikram and Vetal model where the questions are asked. So the purpose of a good learner is besides administrative. There's a lot of administrative work that has to be done. There are plans to be made, but the real job is to ask the right questions and to facilitate conversations in the group. I feel many teachers like to talk a lot. They like to be presenters. That is an old model. Please do a YouTube video of it and give it to students. Don't waste precious classroom time in talking. Have conversations because that is something that Google doesn't allow. So conversations where the collective knowledge of adults, and you don't have children in the room, you have, especially in the case of NIIT, you have educated people coming from different sectors. Each one is bringing a whole bunch of experience, which is different banks or different industries, different experiences, different social groups, different languages. So everyone is bringing a lot of knowledge to the table. If the teacher knows the trick of getting them together, you can never stop talking. You will have so much to exchange, which it's an opportunity that people don't get because in the office, they're too busy focusing on targets and achieving the target. But when I sit in a classroom, for those few hours, management can spare maybe an hour, 2 hours. Can't spare too much, or a day or 2 days. It can spare. It can't spare a lot of time, but it is a great refresher for your critical thinking. And I think that's the learning. So we have to understand, very few CEOs actually get it, how to use 2 things. I always tell people, a good CEO understands how to use a consultant and how to use a training department. These 2 things are a good indicator of how good a leader is because many leaders, when they'll say, "Arey, consultant to kuch kaam nahi karta," and I'm like, so you don't know to use a consultant. Or what is the use of training? And I'm like, oh, you don't get it. So I had this one very pompous CTO telling me that, oh, the Bruce Lee effect hai. After you go for 1 day, you will do exercise and then you'll forget about it. And he is thinking that when my people will go for a training program, they will come back as Superman. I will send Clark Kent and Superman will come out. And I'm like, you really have an extremely poor understanding of learning. I didn't have the heart to tell him because he was revealing his absence of understanding of how to use a learning department and how to use a consultant to enhance his job. So, that he needed a learning for learning academies. So,
Yeah, thanks a lot for this response, and very apt, that CEOs, one of the two things you mentioned interestingly is how to use the training department. And that brings me to the next question. We have been talking about the guru and shishya here. In this audience here, of course, there are lots of gurus and lots of shishyas in the modern context. But then we have lots of business leaders. And their role in learning is very, very important. They are the people who will sponsor learning. They are the people who will send their people for learning. They are the people for whom they'll go back after having learned something. And again, I was reading some of your texts, especially from Talent Sutra. And this whole idea, shall I call the leaders as yajamans here? And they are offering their swaha in the yagya of learning. That's how it is. Now, about Yajaman, what you say is that the gaze is what matters and not the skills. And a cruel gray gaze focuses on compliance, but when the gaze expands, the futility of trying to dominate those around us or domesticating them with rules revealed. I'm just quoting you from Talent Sutra. Now, given that there are many business leaders, CXOs, CEOs here in this forum, what is that we would like to tell them? Because obviously the quality of this yagya of learning depends on the yajman and his gaze to the learning. So what are the key beliefs which will form the right gaze? Would be very keen to hear that from you.
see, the problem in many cases is because of the organizational structure and because everything is divided and leaders are not in the positions of power for a prolonged period of time, the learning modules are not used cleverly. And so everybody is having a little piece of the pie and nobody understands the full picture. But in family businesses, which are the major businesses, I feel there can be a very strong long-term goal of where organizations want to go and where they want to reach and what skills do they want in their team. But it requires clarity of thought. It requires a lot of clarity of what I want, not copy paste, which is often done. But leaders need to understand what they want in their business in order to grow. And how to enable. It could be a simple thing like let's look at housekeeping staff. How do I create a learning program so that I can reduce the cost of housekeeping? It sounds very silly, but it is a very big thing in larger and larger organizations. We have buildings with 30, 40 toilets. And, how do I create a system which is sustainable that reduces my cost of housekeeping or managing air conditioning? I'm giving you easy ones because it's common to understand. But the same thing can happen where I'm clear on goal of improving effectiveness, improving efficiency. If those goals are clearly identified, then learning programs can be worked for the next 2 years or 3 years. This clarity of thought is often missing in the leader. I don't feel a learning program should come from anyone but the leader. It is very, very, you outsource to HR departments, which is a very unfortunate failing of leadership. Because the leaders themselves don't know how to, again, as I said, use consultants, use the people office, they don't know, they're not equipped. For example, you've spent all your life doing sales and suddenly you become CEO, you automatically don't know how to handle consultants and HR departments. We have not trained salespeople of what it requires to be a day in the life of a CEO. One of the advice I would always give people is please work as an EA in your career for 1 year of your life with the CEO so you understand how he uses his 24 hours. And it is shocking how badly CEOs use their 24 hours, wasting time in doing things which are absolutely unnecessary only because they're familiar with it. That's a training program by itself. So these are things that need to be addressed and understood. The larger narratives, as you grow higher in your career, what are the new skills that I need to have? Knowledge I need to have, not attitude, it's training I have an issue with, but definitely knowledge and skills is something that is easy. Knowledge, as I said, downloadable, quite easy, but the skills of understanding that, which requires. So I think the energy in strategizing the learning outcomes and the learning objectives People use these technical words. I've seen a lot of HR people use words like learning objectives, learning outcomes, but they don't explain it to the CEOs ka matlab kya hai. And the CEO is not some magical creature who understands these words. There are no training programs done to enable the person who takes decisions to take proper decisions. And of course, the most leaders are too pompous and too arrogant to assume they think humko sab malum hai. I have seen many CEOs like that who think they know. Somehow by sitting on Vikramaditya's throne, knowledge will come through osmosis. It doesn't come through osmosis. You have to learn, upskill yourself. CEOs have to upskill themselves. And that is something that requires a little bit more. And the fact that others may not upskill the way you do, and they may have skills that you don't. So this requires a little bit of at least 5% of their time on figuring out the learning progress in the organization. And that has to have a real effect on the balance sheet. If it is not connected to the balance sheet, it won't work. It won't work. So balance sheet, Lakshmi Saraswati, that is why in the photographs you always show Lakshmi Saraswati with Ganpati in middle. Because you need Ganpati to remove the obstacle. And so that people understand the learning and its relationship with Lakshmi. Otherwise, it becomes just learning for the sake of learning, or those kind of workshops where you want a break from work, so you go for a learning program. That has its place and value, definitely. Getting away from the office ecosystem, the toxic ecosystems. But I think we need to connect learning department very clearly with balance sheet outcomes.
Thank you very much. And indeed, as you said, learning must come from the business leaders. I do not necessarily share the same perspective of CEOs as you. I've worked with many of the CEOs and CTOs, working with whom has been a pleasure to do a great learning program. But of course, we have seen when there's no such focus, sometimes they do not work. So, great perspective. So thanks a lot for this. I think since we are running out of time, I have time to take only one question. There are many which I can see which are coming in, and I will just take one question, and if you can have a brief response there, that will be very useful. This question is, in my limited understanding of mythology, most learning has been through discipline and suffering. However, today learning is looked at from the prism of creating a fun-based learning experience. How do you see this? Yeah, Devdutt, over to you for a brief response to this.
Well, I think we romanticize suffering and learning, and you have to suffer in order to learn. Learning can be a joyful experience. The simple act of eating food can teach you a lot. And food is always pleasurable. I think it's this whole thing about making education accessible rather than frightening is what they're talking about. And I think knowledge can always be made accessible. That is why music was used at one time to explain philosophy, to make it accessible. So I think that's an effort that we need to do. And it is quite easy. I don't think it's very difficult. It's gamification is the word which is used, but there are other models also. Gamification is just one highly competitive model, really, when you think about it. But there are other, all the board games in the world were invented really to teach people. From Snakes and Ladder was invented to teach people karma. So that was fun.
Very heartening to hear that from you. Learning need not be a process of suffering. Of course, some people have done very well to learn in suffering, but that need not be the case. So really, we learned many things. I think I have many takeaways, and so does the audience. At a high level, I'll just go back and say what you said at the beginning. This is all about handling scale, diversity, and dynamism. And if you do that, all three of them, I think we are off to a great start to not only overcome this crisis situation, but also be prepared for the new world order, as you very rightly put it. So it was great speaking to you, Devdutt, and thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for gracing this occasion for this NIIT Confluence 2021, and very apt to see that you ended with like the food can be pleasurable experience, so does learning. I'm sure many of the people would be wanting to have food now. So this is probably that on this note, I would like to thank you again. And I would want to hand it over again to Dilip. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Pattanaik
Bye bye.
and Dr. Bhatt. A lovely session. And my takeaway is those who don't have a sense of the ancient and history often greet, or in fact, always greet future empty-handed. And that's quite a trouble if you greet future empty-handed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye.